Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm excited to introduce our topic with this first slide, a comprehensive survey of England's greatest medieval poet. We'll be exploring the life, works, themes, and legacy of Geoffrey Chaucer, often called the father of English literature. We'll take a closer look at his most famous writings, including the Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Chryside, the Book of the Duchess, the Parliament of Fowls, the House of Fame, and the Legend of Good Women. Over the next few slides, we'll delve into his contributions and why his work continues to resonate today. So, let's get started. He was often called the morning star of song, a poetic way of saying he was an early and shining talent in literature, who made his music heard below, meaning he shared his stories and ideas with people across different social classes. This quote from Longfellow really captures how influential and beloved he was. Moving on to his career and official roles, he served as the Controller of Customs in London from 1374 to 1386, a position that involved overseeing trade and tariffs. He also acted as a Justice of Peace and a Knight of Shire for Kent, which shows his involvement in law and local governance. Additionally, he was the Clerk of the King's Works between 1389 and 1391, managing royal building projects. In terms of education and law, there's a possibility he studied at Lincoln's Inn or Inner Temple, both of which were important legal institutions. He was deeply well-read, fluent in Latin, French, and Italian, and his literary interests included translating works like the Roman de la Rose and reading Italian authors such as Boccaccio. This multilingual and literary background enriched his writing and understanding of the world. Regarding his early life, he was born around 1343 in London, the son of John Chaucer, a prosperous wine merchant. His middle-class origins were quite unusual for a court poet of his time, which makes his rise to prominence even more noteworthy. Throughout his life, he served important figures like Edward III and later Richard II, traveling to France and Italy on royal missions. These travels exposed him to different cultures and ideas, which clearly influenced his work and perspective. In summary, his background was a mix of legal, diplomatic, and literary pursuits, all shaped by a solid education and a unique social standing. This diverse career and education helped him become the influential figure we study today, connecting his personal journey to the broader themes of literature and societal change in his time. He moved between worlds, the court, the customs house, Parliament, and through his writing, the tavern, the convent, and the road to Canterbury. This range of social observation, from knight to miller, from prioress to pardoner, was truly unprecedented in English letters. Chaucer was Europe's most cosmopolitan English writer. He absorbed stories and ideas from across the continent, Boccaccio's Decameron, with its frame-tale structure for Canterbury Tales, Petrarch's sonnets, Dante's vivid vision of the afterlife, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and the French Roman de la Rose. These influences helped shape his work and broaden the scope of English literature. Chaucer wrote at a pivotal moment in history. English was emerging from French as the language of power after the Norman conquest. He deliberately chose the London vernacular, Middle English, over French or Latin. This decision was revolutionary, helping to standardize and legitimize the language, making it accessible to more people. The institutional church was powerful, but also deeply corrupt. The Great Schism of 1378, with two rival popes, shook people's confidence in Rome. Wycliffe's reform movement was gaining momentum, criticizing the church's excesses. Chaucer's portraits of clergy, like the pardoner, friar, and monk, are sharp satire rooted in the scandals of the time, reflecting a society questioning its spiritual authorities. Meanwhile, England and France were at war throughout Chaucer's life. He was captured by the French in 1359 and ransomed by King Edward III. His trips to Italy in 1372 and 1378 introduced him to Petrarch and Boccaccio, writers who would profoundly influence his literary style and themes, transforming English literature forever. The Black Death, which swept through England in 1348-49, killed about a third of the population. This catastrophe deeply shaped Chaucer's world, disrupting traditional hierarchies, encouraging social mobility, and fueling skepticism about authority, especially the church. These upheavals are vividly reflected in the Canterbury Tales, with its diverse social characters and their stories. All these factors, wars, plague, cultural exchanges, and religious upheaval, created the complex, dynamic world that Chaucer captured in his writing. It's a world in flux, and his work offers us a window into that transformative period of medieval England. Chaucer worked in every available genre, showcasing an incredible range and versatility. He wrote everything from courtly romances and bawdy fabliaux to saints' lives, beast fables, sermons, tragedies, lyrics, allegories, and philosophical dialogues. No other medieval English writer matched his command across such a wide spectrum. In the Canterbury Tales, the narrator presents himself as a friendly but slightly naive pilgrim who reports on the other characters without judgment. Yet, he describes them with sharp, satirical insight. This contrast between the narrator's apparent innocence and the reader's perception creates one of the greatest examples of irony in literature. Chaucer also revolutionized English verse by introducing or popularizing key forms like the iambic pentameter line and the heroic couplet, rhyming pairs of iambic pentameter lines. These became the dominant poetic forms for the next 400 years, influencing giants like Shakespeare, Dryden, and Pope, who built on his foundations. Furthermore, Chaucer wrote in the East Midlands dialect of Middle English, the language that eventually evolved into modern English. Choosing vernacular over Latin or French was a bold move, and it proved that English could carry the full range of literary expression, comedy, tragedy, philosophy, and lyric beauty. So, Chaucer's language, style, and techniques not only shaped medieval literature, but laid the groundwork for the future of English literary tradition. Let's take a closer look at Chaucer's complete works and how they developed over time. In the late period, roughly from the 1380s to 1400, we see some of his most famous works such as The Legend of Good Women, written around 1386, and The Knight's Tale from about 1382. During this time, Chaucer also composed Troilus and Chryside, between 1382 and 1386, and The Parliament of Fowls around 1380 to 1382. Additionally, he worked on The House of Fame, completed roughly between 1378 and 1380. These works reflect a mature phase of his writing, often exploring complex themes and experimenting with form. Moving to the Middle Period, from the 1370s to the 1380s, Chaucer's focus was on shorter works, including a variety of lyric poems and shorter narratives. Notable among these are Aenleda and Arcite from around 1373, the ABC Prayer poem approximately from 1370, and his translation of the Ramont of the Rose around 1366. The Book of the Duchess, completed between 1368 and 1374, also belongs to this period and marks an important step in his poetic development. Finally, in the early period, the 1360s to 1370s, Chaucer was still establishing his voice. During this time, he produced shorter poems and began experimenting with different forms and themes, laying the groundwork for his later masterpieces. Recognizing this chronological progression helps us see how Chaucer's style and scope evolved, shaping his reputation as one of the greatest English poets. This slide focuses on Chaucer's earliest long poem, written around 1368 to 1374. It's significant because it already shows many of his key techniques. For instance, we see a self-deprecating narrator, which adds a layer of humility and relatability. He also uses courtly love conventions, but with a strong sense of irony, showing his awareness of these traditional themes. Plus, he absorbs and tweaks the French allegorical tradition, making it his own. This poem really marks the start of Chaucer's distinctive voice in literature. Moving on to its literary significance, the poem's way of offering consolation is quite unique. The narrator pretends not to understand the knight's grief, which prompts the knight to praise Blanche more openly. This act of making the mourner articulate his love actually becomes a form of comfort. Talking about love helps preserve the memory of the beloved. It's a clever, indirect way of dealing with grief. Now let's look at the Black Knight, who is actually John of Gaunt Mourning Blanche. Chaucer creates a fictional scenario where the narrator discovers the knight's sorrow through a conversation. The knight describes Blanche in elaborate poetic praise, and only at the very end does he admit she's dead. So, the poem reaches its emotional climax with this direct acknowledgement of loss. Chaucer also inherits the French dream vision tradition, like in the Roman de la Rose. The narrator falls asleep while reading Ovid, dreams he joins a hunt, enters a forest, and meets a young man dressed in black. This dream frame allows Chaucer to explore grief from a distance, creating a protective fiction around painful emotions, which makes it easier to confront them. Finally, it's important to note that this poem is Chaucer's first major work. It's an elegy, but disguised as a dream vision, written specifically to console John of Gaunt after the death of Blanche of Lancaster. It's a powerful example of how Chaucer blends form, theme, and technique to address deep emotional experiences. On this slide, we see how love, nature, and the idea that some conflicts have no clear resolution are central themes. The debate among the birds in Chaucer's Parliament of Birds mirrors human conversations about love, where competing claims and values often clash without a definitive answer. Chaucer celebrates this multiplicity of perspectives rather than trying to resolve them into one truth. This poem is significant because it's also linked to the first known association of St. Valentine's Day with romantic love. In the poem, the birds gather in a playful, ironic, and ultimately inconclusive debate over which eagle suitor will win the female eagle. It's a short but rich work, consisting of about 699 lines, and it's narrated through a dream vision. The narrator reads Cicero's Dream of Scipio, then falls asleep, and is led by an African eagle into a garden of love where birds assemble to choose their mates. Moving on, the Parliament of Birds was written around 1380 to 1382 and showcases Chaucer's interest in the theme of fame. Here, fame is shown as arbitrary, sometimes awarded, sometimes withdrawn, regardless of merit. This reflects a skeptical view of literary fame and posterity, which is very much in Chaucer's style. Chaucer's engagement with Dante is also evident. The eagle, for example, symbolizes the cosmic journey. The eagle's comic pedantry adds humor and depth, as it questions what truly makes a reputation last. This concern about lasting fame foreshadows themes Chaucer explores more fully in his later works. Finally, The House of Fame, written between 1378 and 1380, is a dream vision in 3 parts. In it, Chaucer's narrator is lifted by an eagle to the Palace of Fame, where reputation is doled out arbitrarily. The poem remains unfinished, stopping mid-sentence, which adds to its mysterious and intriguing nature. So both works illustrate Chaucer's fascination with how fame and love are constructed, debated, and ultimately elusive, highlighting the complex, often inconclusive nature of human values and perceptions. This slide highlights why Troilus and Chrysaide is often called the first great novel in English. It's remarkable for its psychological depth, its sophisticated narrative point of view, and the complexity of its characters, features that actually anticipate the novel as a form by over 300 years. C.S. Lewis even regarded it as one of the greatest poems in the English language. Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, by contrast, adapts Chaucer's original but darkens its tone, emphasizing the tragic and cynical aspects of love and war. Now, moving to its literary significance, this poem is deeply influenced by Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which Chaucer translated. You can see this influence in the way fortune plays a central role. Fortune's wheel turns, and those who rise must fall. Troilus's happiness, from the start, is shown to be temporary and fleeting. Chaucer infuses this pagan story with a Christian melancholy, suggesting that earthly love can't be the ultimate destination for desire. Next, let's talk about Pandarus, Chryseide's uncle. He's witty, practical, manipulative, but also genuinely caring. His role in engineering the love affair out of friendship for Troilus is complex. His name even gave English the word pander. But he's not simply a villain. He loves both Troilus and Chrysaide and struggles to understand where things went wrong. Chrysaide herself is arguably Chaucer's greatest character. She's vulnerable, being a widow in enemy-occupied Troy, yet intelligent and genuinely loving. Chaucer refuses to condemn her, emphasizing her human complexity. The narrator even suggests that she gave her heart to Troilus willingly, and Chaucer himself refrains from passing judgment. Troilus embodies the idealist. His love for Chryseide is all-consuming, representing the height of courtly love tradition. His happiness in Act III is a peak of the poem, but the tragic arc unfolds as he discovers Chryseide's betrayal and ultimately dies in battle. He's a classic romantic idealist, yet his story also serves as a meditation on love's fragility. This work is an adaptation of Boccaccio's Il Filostrato, but Chaucer transforms it profoundly. He adds psychological depth, philosophical weight, especially through Boethius, and a tragic consciousness that wasn't present in the original. Chaucer turns what could have been just a story of war into a deep exploration of inner life, love, and loss. Finally, Chaucer's Troilus and Chryseide stands as his greatest achievement in verse narrative. It's a rich, psychological study that spans over 8,200 lines in rhyme royal, capturing the complexities of love, betrayal, and human vulnerability in Troy. Now, let's explore some of Chaucer's key works. First, we have Boece, which is Chaucer's prose translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. This was one of the most important Latin texts during the Middle Ages. It deals with themes like fortune, free will, and providence, topics that run through much of Chaucer's later work. The translation was widely read and had a significant influence on English prose, helping shape the development of literary language in England. Next, there's the treatise on the astrolabe, written around 1391 for Chaucer's son, Lewis. This is quite remarkable because it's the earliest scientific prose in English. It shows Chaucer's deep interest in astronomy, mathematics, and practical sciences, areas that complement his literary pursuits. It reflects his broad intellectual curiosity and willingness to engage with scientific topics of his time. Moving on, Chaucer also wrote a dream vision where the god of love reproaches him for speaking ill of women in Troilus. In response, Queen Alceste intercedes and sentences Chaucer to write stories about faithful women. This leads to 9 legendary tales: Cleopatra, Thisbe, Dido, Hypsipyle, Medea, Lucrece, Ariadne, Philomela, Phillis, and Hypernestra. Interestingly, Chaucer apparently abandoned this project to focus on the Canterbury Tales, but the legend of good women remains significant. It's notable for being the first use of the heroic couplet in English, and the prologue, in its 2 versions, is among Chaucer's most delightful poetry. These legends are shorter and more direct than his usual style, making them quite accessible. Finally, the Legend of Good Women, written around 1386 to 1387, encapsulates many of these themes. It's an important work that highlights Chaucer's interest in love, virtue, and storytelling, tying together his literary and moral concerns in a way that enriches our understanding of his overall contribution to English literature. Let's take a closer look at the overview and structure of the Canterbury Tales. This collection is often considered Chaucer's masterpiece, offering a vivid social portrait of 14th-century England. It begins with the general prologue, where Chaucer introduces the pilgrims in 858 lines, showcasing their personalities with wit and precision. These pilgrims come from all walks of life, from knights and prioresses to millers and cooks, making it one of the most socially diverse casts in medieval literature. The core of the work features around 24 tales, though Chaucer originally planned for over 120. These stories span a variety of genres: verse and prose, comedy and tragedy, romance and sermons, reflecting the rich tapestry of medieval storytelling. The pilgrims gather at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, where the host Harry Bailey suggests a storytelling contest, each pilgrim to tell 4 tales, creating a frame story that ties everything together. Chaucer's collection, begun around 1387, remains unfinished at his death in 1400. The structure of the Canterbury Tales, with its mix of characters and diverse stories, offers a fascinating window into medieval society, highlighting both the universality and particularity of human experience. It's a brilliant example of how storytelling can capture the complexities of life across social boundaries. Now, on slide 11, we see how Chaucer masterfully introduces a variety of characters that together form a miniature society. The description begins with the miller, a robust, red-bearded man who's coarse and disruptive. He tells his tale out of order, deliberately flipping the usual romantic narrative with a fablio of cuckolding and revenge. This contrasts sharply with the more idealized stories that came before, like the knight's courtly romance, highlighting Chaucer's skill in storytelling and satire. Moving on, we encounter the third estate, which includes the commoners, represented here by the miller and Alison of Bath. Alison is a clothmaker, 5 times married, full of experience and opinions. Her lengthy prologue functions almost as a fictional autobiography, and through her, Chaucer both embodies and satirizes the anti-feminist tradition. In the bourgeoisie, we find the wife of Bath, a bold and complex character, someone who's been married multiple times and is unafraid to speak her mind. Her prologue reveals her as a savvy, sometimes cynical trader of relics, embodying a kind of practiced deception that Chaucer explores with sharp insight. Turning to the church, we see figures like the pardoner, a fat monk who loves hunting and rejects monastic discipline. Chaucer describes him with a mix of approval and critique, creating a powerful satire by juxtaposing his appearance and behavior with his spiritual emptiness. Similarly, the first estate includes the monk and the prioress. The monk is a comic figure, more concerned with worldly pleasures than spiritual duties, while the prioress appears idealized but is subtly shown to be somewhat stained by worldly concerns. Her armor is bismotored, hinting at her human flaws behind her piety. Finally, we have the knight, the most noble pilgrim and the central figure of the opening 858 lines. Chaucer's detailed portrait of him combines admiration with gentle satire, setting the tone for the social diversity and complexity that will unfold throughout the tales. All these characters together form a society in miniature, each revealing different facets of medieval life, and through their stories and descriptions, Chaucer offers a rich, nuanced picture of his world. Let's look at the opening contrast between the Knight's Tale and the Miller's Tale. The Knight's Tale is a romantic story of chivalric love set in Athens, involving 2 knights, Palamon and Arcite, who are imprisoned but both fall for Emily through a window. They then compete in a tournament, which Arcite wins, but tragically dies in an accident. Palamon eventually marries Emily. This tale is based on Boccaccio's Tessada and explores deep philosophical questions about fate, justice, and divine providence. It features elaborate tournament machinery and gods like Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Diana, emphasizing the role of divine forces in human affairs. Now, in stark contrast, The Miller's Tale is a comic, vulgar parody set in a bourgeois Oxford household. Instead of chivalry and divine intervention, it revolves around a comedic cuckolding story involving a carpenter named John, his young wife Alison, her lover Nicholas, and a rival named Absalon. Interestingly, The Miller's Tale mirrors the love triangle structure of The Knight's Tale, but it subverts it with bawdy humor and everyday vulgarity. It ends not with noble resolution, but with a humorous, almost slapstick, punishment involving a red-hot plowshare. This contrast highlights our overall theme: the body versus the soul, vulgarity versus refinement, popular culture versus aristocratic culture. The Miller deliberately inverts the serious, noble tone of The Knight's Tale, and Chaucer masterfully presents both with equal artistic skill, without showing preference for either. On this slide, we see that the wife of Bath anticipates Shakespeare's Falstaff in her energy and self-knowledge. Virginia Woolf even identified her as a breakthrough in how women's consciousness is represented. She remains one of the most discussed figures in Chaucer scholarship, highlighting her lasting significance. Her voice is incredibly vivid, rhythmically lively, argumentatively brilliant, and emotionally raw. She digresses, contradicts herself, and laughs at herself, making her a truly dynamic character. In fact, she's often considered the most novelistic figure before the novel was even a genre. When we talk about her voice and characterization, critics debate whether she's Chaucer's proto-feminist or a satirical portrait of feminine excess. But I think it's both. deliberately so. She's a fictional character, yet she speaks truths that the text sometimes undercuts. The irony isn't fixed. It's generative, meaning it invites us to think rather than settle on a single interpretation. Moving to her feminist reading and irony, the tale itself is about a knight condemned to death for rape, who must answer, "What do women most desire?" An old hag tells him, sovereignty, meaning mastery over their husbands. He marries her, she transforms into a beautiful woman, and the story ultimately answers the question within itself. Her fifth husband, Jenkin, reads from a misogynist book, but she tears out pages, challenging that tradition. Chaucer here becomes radical, giving voice to a woman who's often silenced by the very texts that try to define her. In her recounting of her 5 marriages, she argues convincingly that women deserve sovereignty in marriage. Her life is her argument. She's been a merchant's apprentice in love, managing each husband, and her story is a powerful act of self-presentation. Finally, the prologue, with its 828 lines plus the tale, showcases her as Chaucer's most complex creation, a proto-feminist voice embedded within a misogynist tradition, which she both embodies and subverts. She's truly one of Chaucer's greatest portraits, blending personal autobiography with a broader social critique. Today, we delve into a truly remarkable example of Chaucer's mastery, The Nun's Priest's Tale. This story is a brilliant mock-heroic beast fable featuring Chanticleer, the proud rooster, and his favorite wife Pertolote. The tale begins with Chanticleer having a vivid dream of a fox, which Pertolote quickly dismisses, dismissing the dream as mere foolishness. But of course, the danger is real. Soon a fox captures Chanticleer. The clever rooster, however, escapes through his wit, turning the tables on his predator. What makes this story especially fascinating is how it employs the grandeur of epic poetry. Think Homeric similes, classical allusions, and philosophical debates, applied to a humble farmyard setting. The humor emerges from this stark contrast between style and subject. Thematically, it explores dreams and their interpretations, the tension between predestination and free will, and the power of rhetoric, especially deception, and how appearances can deceive us. Beneath the comedy, there are serious questions about Boethian philosophy, about whether we are masters of our fate or subject to destiny. This tale is a prime example of Chaucer's mock-heroic mode, showcasing his ability to shift seamlessly between lofty style and down-to-earth reality. It truly reveals his poetic range and mastery of tone. So, in essence, The Nun's Priest's Tale is not just a humorous story. It's a layered exploration of human nature, perception, and philosophy, all wrapped in a charming farmyard fable. Now, let's turn to the final word on penitence. Chaucer ends his collection with a prose sermon on penitence, highlighting its importance as a spiritual act. Interestingly, he follows this with his retraction, where he formally withdraws his secular works. Scholars have debated whether Chaucer's retraction is sincere or perhaps ironic. It adds a layer of moral ambiguity to the entire collection, making us question the true nature of his intentions. Moving on to the next section, we have the Parson's Tale. This is a series of tragedies featuring famous figures who have fallen from high status. Each story illustrates the concept of fortune's wheel, how luck can turn unexpectedly. These tales are quite heavy, and the knight actually has to intervene to stop the monk from continuing because they become too depressing. Then there's the Monk's Tale. This one is a bit of a narrative feud. 2 pilgrims tell tales that are essentially a back and forth about tragic falls. The friar tells a story about a corrupt summoner who is taken by the devil, while the summoner retorts with a satire about a friar who receives a gift of sound, poking fun at religious figures. These tales create a lively, satirical dispute that highlights the moral complexities of each character. Next, we have the Merchant's Tale, which is quite different in tone. It involves May and her old husband, January, in a bitter comedy. The story involves a young wife and her elderly husband, and it's filled with irony and revenge, reflecting the merchant's own recent experiences with marriage. It's a sharp commentary on relationships and perhaps a bit of personal venting. Moving forward, the Franklin's Tale offers a different moral focus. It's a Breton lie about a wife's rash promise, centered around the theme of gentleness, true nobility. Each character acts with nobility in their own way, demonstrating that generosity and virtue generate more goodness in return. It's a hopeful story about the power of noble behavior. Finally, we come to the Clerk's Tale, which is based on the story of Griselda. It's a profound meditation on patience, suffering, and obedience. Her husband, Walter, tests her to the limit, removing her children and pretending to replace her, yet she endures with remarkable patience. This tale, inspired by Petrarch, can be quite uncomfortable for modern readers because of its emphasis on obedience and suffering, but it also challenges us to think about the nature of virtue. All these stories, along with the others in the collection, serve to explore different facets of morality, human weakness, and virtue, fitting into the overarching theme of moral reflection that runs through the entire Canterbury Tales. Let's take a closer look at slide 16, which showcases some of Chaucer's shorter poems, lyrics, and ballades. These works reveal a different dimension of his artistry beyond his famous major texts. First, there's the comic love lyric that parodies courtly conventions. Imagine a narrator comparing himself to a fish swimming in sauce. It's a playful, humorous take on love. Chaucer applies his wit here, turning a traditionally earnest lyric into something witty and lighthearted. Next, we have the To Rosamond, a set of 3 roundels on love. These are witty, playful poems with a triple rhyme scheme and clever conceits. The final roundel, where he says, "Your yen two wall slee me suddenly," meaning, "Your 2 eyes will kill me suddenly," actually turns the typical courtly love tradition on its head with irony, highlighting Chaucer's skill in blending humor with tradition. Moving on, there's Mursel's Bute, a comic begging poem directed at King Henry IV. Chaucer humorously requests his pension renewal and displays self-deprecation, which serves a practical purpose. It's both amusing and strategic. Notably, this poem is addressed to Henry IV, making it one of Chaucer's last works, written just before his death. Then we come to the Complaint of Chaucer to his Purse, a moral reflection on the instability and corruption of his time, addressed to King Richard II. Chaucer advises him to show forth thy sword of castigation, urging moral strength. Written in the 1390s, this poem is quite dark and topical, especially considering Richard's eventual deposition. We also see Lack of Steadfastness, a ballad emphasizing that true nobility comes from virtue, not birth. Chaucer famously states, "The first father and founder of gentleness was Christ," which was quite a radical idea in a feudal society that often equated rank with moral worth. Then there's Gentleness, a moral lyric advising people to withdraw from the corrupt court and seek sincerity, flee fro the prise, and dwell with soothfastness. This is probably one of Chaucer's most personal poems, possibly written late in life. Its refrain, "Trouth shall deliver, hit is no dreed," underscores his deep commitment to truth over expediency. Finally, we have Truth, or Ballade de Bon Conseil, which reflects Chaucer's philosophical stance. Throughout his shorter works, he explores moral, comic, and lyric themes, showing us a different side of his poetic genius beyond his major narratives. All of these works help us see Chaucer not just as a storyteller, but as a versatile poet capable of wit, moral reflection, and personal insight, an essential part of understanding his overall contribution to literature. In this slide, I want to highlight how Chaucer cleverly structures his storytelling to showcase a wide range of social classes and tones. He sets up a contrast within the pilgrimage itself, starting with the knight's noble tragedy, then shifting to the miller's bawdy comedy, and finally moving to the reeve's bitter tale of revenge. This progression demonstrates that the pilgrimage contains all of society and all of life's registers. No single tone dominates. Chaucer is always the craftsman behind each voice, capable of capturing both high and low, serious and comic. Now, moving to the theme of comedy versus tragedy, characters like the wife of Bath, the merchant, and the Franklin represent the emerging merchant class. They are wealthy, ambitious, and resistant to the traditional aristocratic hierarchy. Their stories reflect new values. For example, the Franklin's tale of gentleness argues that virtue isn't inherited but cultivated. Meanwhile, the wife's tale emphasizes giving sovereignty to women, challenging societal norms. Next, we see Chaucer's most sustained satire targeting the church. The monk hunts, the friar flatters rich donors, the pardoner sells fake relics, and the summoner takes bribes. Only the humble parson genuinely lives his vows. This stark contrast between the ideal and the corrupt reality fuels Chaucer's satirical critique. Finally, let's consider the three estates, those who pray, fight, and work. Chaucer populates his tales with representatives of each, revealing the gap between the societal theory and actual practice. He's the first great social satirist in England, offering portraits of the church, the nobility, and the commons that are both warm and devastating. All of this underscores how Chaucer masterfully explores social class, morality, and societal flaws through his storytelling. Troilus's love for Chrysaide takes on a quasi-religious intensity. He is transformed by it, ennobled by it, and ultimately destroyed by it. Chaucer shows us love at its most idealistic and its most fragile. The Boethian framework raises the question of whether earthly love can truly satisfy the soul's deepest desire, and the answer it suggests is generally no. Moving on to love as a form of power negotiation, we see the wife of Bath wanting sovereignty in her relationships. Her 5 marriages serve as a kind of laboratory for understanding human dynamics. Chaucer presents her with both a feminist argument, that women deserve equality, and a satirical counterpoint, highlighting her manipulative methods. Both perspectives are valid within her story. Next, we come to the wife of Bath's vision, which is a key moment of insight about love and power. Then we have the bawdy comic tales, the Miller's Tale, Reeve's Tale, Merchant's Tale, and Shipman's Tale. These stories are full of adultery, cuckolding, and bodily comedy, showcasing Chaucer's skill in moving effortlessly between courtly love and the fabliau tradition without any embarrassment. He treats both with artistic seriousness, which really emphasizes the complexity and range of his storytelling. Speaking of the fabliau tradition, Chaucer inherits this tradition of Finhammer, the knight suffering in devotion to an unattainable lady. We see this in the Knight's Tale, Troilus and Chrysaide, and many shorter poems. But Chaucer always injects irony into these conventions, making us see them as both beautiful and artificial at the same time. Finally, in the courtly love tradition, love in Chaucer is never straightforward. He explores it across a spectrum, from the idealized, lofty love to the farcical and humorous. Throughout, Chaucer examines these conventions with a sharp, clear-eyed irony, which makes his portrayal of love so rich and multidimensional. On this slide, we see how philosophy, particularly Boethius's teachings, informs Chaucer's work. According to Boethius, worldly goods like wealth, power, and pleasure are not true goods because they are fleeting. They perish over time. Instead, the true good is God, the eternal and unchanging source of all that is good. Chaucer explores this idea by testing it against different aspects of human experience: the beauty of love, as depicted in Troilus, the pleasure found in comedy, through fabliaux, and the rich variety of human life, showcased in the Canterbury Tales. Importantly, Chaucer presents these ideas without necessarily endorsing them, allowing us to ponder the complex relationship between earthly pleasures and eternal truths. Moving on, Chaucer's translation of Boethius's Consolation was incredibly influential. His prose translation helped legitimize philosophical discussion in the English vernacular, making such profound ideas accessible to a broader audience. This act of translation was, in itself, a philosophical gesture, bringing these timeless questions into the common language and fostering a deeper engagement with philosophical thought. Now, let's consider the question of free will versus divine foreknowledge. In Troilus, Chaucer meditates on whether humans can truly be free if God knows everything that will happen. The Knight's Tale raises similar questions through the competing gods, illustrating different notions of divine influence and human agency. Chaucer raises these questions honestly, without providing easy answers, highlighting his characteristic intellectual honesty. Next, we have the image of Fortune's wheel, a core Boethian concept. Fortune turns her wheel unpredictably. Those who are at the top may fall, and those at the bottom may rise. You see this idea reflected throughout Troilus and Chrysaide, the Knight's Tale, and the Monk's Tale. It offers a way to understand tragedy and change without necessarily invoking theological explanations, emphasizing the randomness and unpredictability of life. Finally, we recognize that Boethius's consolation remains a key philosophical backbone for Chaucer. Translated by him and woven into his major works, it provides a framework for exploring themes of fortune, fate, and human resilience. Together, these elements help us appreciate how Chaucer engages with philosophical ideas, making complex questions about life, destiny, and divine justice accessible and compelling for his audience. Let's talk about Chaucer's women and how they represent a wide spectrum of characters. Some, like Emily in The Knight's Tale, are quite passive. She's essentially the object of a contest, barely more than a character in the story. Then we have women like Dorigen in The Franklin's Tale, who are much more complex. Her rash promise actually drives the entire plot, showing a woman whose actions have real consequences. And at the extreme end, there's Griselda, often seen as the embodiment of patience as a virtue, but some might see her story as a form of horror, depending on how you interpret her endurance. What's interesting is that Chaucer doesn't endorse just one type of womanhood. Instead, he presents a variety of models, reflecting the complexity and diversity of women's roles and characters. Now let's look at Chryseide in Troilus. Her situation is carefully managed. She's a widow in occupied Troy, caught between her circumstances and the pressures from her uncle and the Greeks. Chaucer is quite careful here. He refuses to condemn her outright. His narrator even steps back from judgment, saying, "I say not that she yaff him higher hurt," meaning he can't quite bring himself to judge her actions. Moving to the broader context, Chaucer's collection of stories about faithful women, like Cleopatra, Thisbe, Dido, and Lucrece, might seem straightforward. But the way Chaucer frames these stories, and the repetition of themes, men are always faithless, women are faithful, creates a subtle irony. It suggests that the narrative might be more complicated than it first appears, perhaps questioning the simplicity of those traditional roles. This leads us to the medieval debate about women. Are they good or bad? Chaucer's work engages with this long-standing tradition. For example, in The Legend of Good Women, he celebrates virtuous women, while The Wife of Bath quotes anti-feminist authorities extensively. The Merchant's portrayal of May, too, is quite bitter. Yet, Chaucer also gives voice to women who surpass these traditional stereotypes, challenging the negative narratives. Finally, this all ties into the larger theme of the Querelle des Femmes, the debate about women's nature. Chaucer inherits a medieval tradition filled with misogyny, but he also creates some of the most vivid and complex women in medieval English literature. He navigates this tradition carefully, sometimes reinforcing it, but also challenging it through his characters and stories. Now let's look at how Chaucer cleverly parodies his own work within the Tales. When the host asks for a story, Chaucer the Pilgrim narrates Sir Thopas, which is a deliberately terrible parody of a popular romance. This self-parody shows Chaucer mocking the very form he's using, and it also pokes fun at himself through the fictional frame. It's quite remarkable. Literally 600 years before postmodernism, Chaucer is engaging in literary self-consciousness. Moving on to the genre play and parody, Chaucer ends the Canterbury Tales with the Parson's Tale, a serious sermon, and then his retraction, where he formally withdraws his secular works. But here's the interesting part. The retraction appears at the very end, after all the secular stories have been told and enjoyed. So whether Chaucer is sincere or ironic in this withdrawal remains one of his greatest ambiguities. Now let's discuss the retraction as irony. The Canterbury Tales functions on multiple levels. Chaucer the poet creates Chaucer the Pilgrim narrator, who reports what the host organizes and what the pilgrims tell. Each of these levels introduces some interpretive distance. When something in the stories is offensive or questionable, Chaucer the poet remains protected, because it's Chaucer the Pilgrim reporting what he heard, not necessarily endorsing it. Next, we see the power of framing within framing. For example, in the general prologue, the narrator describes the monk's love of hunting as if he approves, saying, "And I said his opinion was good." But the reader immediately perceives the irony. A monk who hunts is clearly violating his vows. The narrator, however, misses this. This creates a satirical space, the gap between what the narrator perceives and what the reader perceives, adding depth and complexity to the narrative. Finally, Chaucer's most distinctive technique is this naive narrator, the gap between what the narrator seems to understand and what the author truly knows. This creates some of the deepest irony and makes Chaucer's work so revolutionary. It's a core part of his narrative style that continues to influence storytelling even today. So, in summary, Chaucer masterfully employs irony, layered narrative techniques, and self-awareness to enrich his storytelling, making the Canterbury Tales a pioneering work that operates on multiple interpretive levels. Let's take a closer look at some of Chaucer's most innovative literary techniques. First, we see characters like Chryside, the Pardoner, and the Wife of Bath showcasing inner lives, contradictions, and psychological complexity that were truly unprecedented in medieval literature. Chaucer makes his characters feel real because they are inherently inconsistent, often self-deceiving, and emotionally rich. This approach is what we call psychological realism. For example, in Troilus and Chryside, or in many of the serious sections of the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer delves deeply into his characters' minds and motives, making them multifaceted and human. Next, let's talk about rhyme royal, Chaucer's preferred poetic form for serious poetry, using 7-line stanzas in ABABBCC rhyme scheme and written in iambic pentameter. You see this in Troilus and Chryside, The Knight's Tale, and much of the Canterbury Tales. It lends a noble, elevated tone suited for serious storytelling. Then there's the concept of mock epic or burlesque. Chaucer applies the grandeur of high epic to trivial or comic subjects. For instance, The Nun's Priest's Tale or Sir Thopa's parody traditional romance, creating humor through the contrast between the lofty form and the humble content. It's a clever way to entertain and critique at the same time. Moving on, ironic characterization is another key technique. Take the Wife of Bath's prologue or the Pardoner's prologue. These are extended first-person speeches where characters reveal their personalities and worldviews. Chaucer's mastery is in showing how characters' self-presentations can be ironic, exposing their flaws or contradictions through detail, often making us see beyond their own self-perception. Finally, we have the frame narrative, which is the overarching story structure. The pilgrimage frame in the Canterbury Tales, for example, contains all the individual stories. This device, borrowed from Boccaccio and the Arabian Nights, allows for incredible variety within a single work and creates complex relationships between the stories, enriching the overall narrative experience. Together, these techniques, psychological depth, formal innovation, parody, irony, and structural design, are what make Chaucer's work so dynamic and influential, shaping the development of English literature. In this slide, we see the Pardoner revealing himself completely. He preaches against the very sin he embodies, greed, and this self-awareness without any effort to correct his faults makes him particularly disturbing. It's a striking example of how self-knowledge can become dangerous if not accompanied by self-improvement. The Pardoner, therefore, becomes a portrait of will divorced from intelligence, acting on desire rather than understanding. Moving on, we hear from the Pardoner's prologue where he openly admits, Radix malorum est cupiditas, which means, the root of all evils is greed. He even preaches against the vice of greed, which he himself practices. This paradoxical stance highlights the complexity of his character and the moral ambiguities within the Tales. Next, the Wife of Bath challenges conventional authority by placing experience, what she has lived through, above written texts or scholarly knowledge. This is one of Chaucer's most radical moves in epistemology, emphasizing the importance of bodily knowledge and lived experience over book learning. She boldly states that her personal experience of marriage is enough for her to speak about it, even without the backing of authority or tradition. Then we see Chaucer's humility and hope as he sends his poem out into the world. There's a contrast here between tragedy, as seen in Troilus, and comedy, perhaps represented by the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer seems to map his own journey as a writer, balancing serious themes with humor and storytelling. In the next passage, Chaucer reflects on the challenge of art itself. Drawing from Hippocrates, he notes that creating art, whether poetry or medicine, is difficult and labor-intensive. The line, "the life so short, the craft so long to learn," reminds us that mastery takes time and effort, setting the stage for appreciating the craftsmanship behind his work. Finally, we arrive at the most famous opening in English poetry. Chaucer describes spring as a time of pilgrimage and renewal. The long, energetic sentence about April's showers and the awakening earth captures the restless, hopeful spirit of spring, which symbolizes new beginnings and the journey ahead, both literally and metaphorically. The wife of Bath continues to be a fundamental figure in feminist literary studies, serving as a powerful touchstone for exploring gender and authority. Chaucer's portrayal of corrupt clergy still resonates today, reflecting a modern anti-institutional sentiment that many audiences can relate to. His use of irony and keen social observation make his work feel remarkably contemporary, bridging the gap between medieval society and our own. The Canterbury Tales, originally written over 600 years ago, have been adapted into countless modern formats: film, TV, stage, even graphic novels, showing their enduring relevance. Chaucer is arguably the most widely taught medieval English author in universities worldwide, and modern scholarship, feminist, Marxist, post-colonial, continues to uncover new layers of meaning in his work. Since the 16th century, he has been called the father of English literature, a testament to his central place in our literary tradition. He's even buried in Westminster Abbey as the first poet in Poets' Corner, cementing his legacy. Many great writers, Pope, Keats, Tennyson, Virginia Woolf, acknowledge his influence, recognizing his centrality to English literature. Dryden translated the Canterbury Tales and called Chaucer the father of English poetry, while Spenser, in The Faerie Queene, referred to him as the well of English undefiled. Shakespeare drew from Chaucer's work in plays like Troilus and Cressida, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Two Noble Kinsmen. In terms of literary influence, Chaucer introduced the heroic couplet, which became dominant in the 18th century. He coined or first recorded hundreds of English words, significantly enriching the language. He popularized iambic pentameter, and importantly, he helped standardize the London dialect as the literary standard, laying the groundwork for modern English. All of these contributions underscore why Chaucer is rightly called the father of English literature. His legacy shaped the language, the literary forms, and the very foundation of English cultural identity that we still build on today. Chaucer was truly a pioneer, the first to breathe life into a new world of English literature. As G.K. Chesterton said, he was the first to give the breath of life to this literary landscape. Born around 1343 and passing away on October 25, 1400, he was buried in Westminster Abbey and became the very first occupant of what we now call Poets' Corner. He's often called the father of English literature because of his profound influence on poetry that followed. His legacy is immense, shaping not just one style but multiple techniques and themes. For example, he popularized the heroic couplet, crafted complex frame narratives, and explored psychological realism, all of which pushed the boundaries of storytelling and poetic form. When we look at his major works, like the Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Cressida, and Dream Visions, what stands out is his incredible ability to blend different elements. Chaucer's greatness lies in his unique combination: a social satirist with a broad scope, a psychological novelist with deep insight, a poet with musicality, and a thinker with serious philosophical concerns. And he wields irony with such finesse that every century finds new reflections of itself in his work. His themes are just as rich, covering class, love, fortune, gender, irony, faith, and corruption, showing us the human condition from multiple angles. His stories are windows into medieval life, but also timeless reflections on human nature. In essence, Chaucer's work is a masterful blend of technique, theme, and insight, making him a foundational figure whose influence continues to resonate. His ability to mirror society's complexities with humor and depth is what makes his legacy so enduring and relevant even today.